Hello, good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to this week's Signpost series. Hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Mark Gibson, and I'm also joined by Pat Murphy, who's head of the Teagasc Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme. Good morning, Pat.
Good morning.
And just to remind everybody that today's series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland, SkillNet, and also the National Rural Network. So in response to declining bird populations, the Irish government has declared a biodiversity emergency. So today we're going to discuss birds of conservation concern, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Anita Donaghy and Una Duggan from Birdwatch Ireland, who are going to discuss the implications of these declining bird populations. So if I could ask Anita and Una to maybe switch off your camera, switch on your cameras, and we should be able to see you on screen there. Perfect. You're both very, very welcome to the Signpost series. Good morning, Anita.
Good morning.
You're joining us from a beautiful part of the country.
Yes, I'm in Donegal this morning, Mark. So yeah, lovely day here actually. So
Great, great.
Nice to be with you.
Thanks, Anita. And Una, good morning to you. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining from Birdwatch HQ in Kilcool, County Wicklow.
Very good, very good. Well, good morning to you. And Pat, all down in Wexford this morning?
Yeah, sunny southeast is living up to his name this morning.
Right. So we've all corners of Ireland covered today. So really looking forward to today's discussion. Anita, you're going to give us a presentation in a moment, but maybe before we do that, if I could just ask you about the work that you're doing in Birdwatch Ireland, in your area of conservancy, your responsibilities and so forth.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So yes, I'm the assistant head of conservation in charge of species and land management. So most of my work is related to the practical implementation of work on the ground for a range of species, from seabirds to breeding waders, and also includes our reserves work. So quite a lot of work going on for us at the moment. That's mostly where I'm involved at the practical delivery end. So yeah, that's what I do mostly.
And Una, you're working on the policy side of things within Birdwatch Ireland. I know you were sitting on the agri-food strategy working group, if I'm right on that.
No.
You're feeding into it.
I wasn't. So I work on advocacy for Birdwatch Ireland, and that means trying to get through to decision makers and to the wider public, I suppose, everybody, about the importance of protecting and conservation of bird species, but also for healthy ecosystems. So that includes, I am the environmental pillar, one of the two environmental pillar representatives to the CAP Consultative Committee, but I'm also on the steering committee of the environmental pillar and Stop Climate Chaos as well. So would feed into other processes in that way. But just to say as well, Birdwatch Ireland has 15,000 members nationwide. We have 25 branches all around the country. We have offices when they're open in Letterkenny, Belmullet, Banagher, and in Galway. So we're the largest conservation NGO in the country for biodiversity.
Brilliant. Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll go straight to the presentation, Anita's presentation, and we will take questions afterwards, and really looking forward to the discussion after the presentation. So please do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask a question of Una or of Anita. And we'll also to remind you that there is a live transcription facility. We just switch it on now for those of you who would like to be able to just to view the screen and rather than having your audio on. And today's session is being recorded, and the presentation will be available on the Teagasc website afterwards. So Anita, that looks good. So we'll hand over to you. Now, you might be gone on mute there, Anita. We can't hear you. You might need to go up to the very top of your screen, I think, just to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you
perfect.
hear me okay?
That's perfect. That's
Grand.
lovely. Thanks, Anita.
So just I can bring my presentation up here. Can everybody see that first slide?
Yes, that looks good.
Yeah. Okay. So apologies there for that. As I said earlier, my name is Anita Dunny. I'm the Head of Species and Land Management with Birdwatch Ireland. And today I'm going to talk about birds of conservation concern in Ireland, or BOCI 4 as we call it, which is the fourth assessment of the status of birds in Ireland. And we've done 4 assessments. As I mentioned, the first one was in 1999, and I was the co-author of that report. And we've done them about once every 7 years since. So this is number 4. This is BOCI 4.
Sorry to interrupt, Anita. If you could move a little closer to the microphone. It's just
sorry.
a bit
Sorry.
faint.
Yeah,
Thanks.
is that better?
It's a bit better, yes, thanks.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So this is, as mentioned, the 4th assessment of the status of birds in Ireland since 1999. We've done them about once every 7 years since then. And before I go on to talk about the list and what we found, I think it's just important to remember that birds are indicators of our wider environment. They are one of the best studied groups of organisms, as well as being very visible. Because of this, they are an excellent barometer of what is happening to our wider biodiversity. And I think we're all very aware of the fact that a healthy ecosystem has a variety and abundance within it. It provides vital ecosystem services such as pollination, water purification, and carbon storage. And these in turn are building blocks for life, food, water, clean air. And so declines in bird populations are barometers that we should pay attention to, as they represent really wider changes that are occurring in our ecosystems. So I just wanted to make that clear from the start. So a bit more about the assessment then. It's a scientific assessment carried out by Birdwatch Ireland and our sister organisation in Northern Ireland, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. We base it on data from a variety of different bird studies and monitoring schemes that are happening across the island of Ireland. And we use standard quantitative criteria, which have been applied at a global, European and national level. And within Ireland, we also assess historical decline. We assess trends in bird population size and range, as well as other criteria. So all of these different criteria feed in to the assessment to come up with the list. So we use a traffic light approach. There are 3 lists: the red, amber and green lists. And obviously the red list are the species that we are most concerned about. These are the species that are undergoing severe declines. And we class severe declines as a decline in range or population of greater than 50% over the last 25 years. Species that are on the amber list are experiencing more moderate declines, for example, in the region of 25 to 50 to 49% over the last 25 years. So these are the species that we want to look out for. They haven't made it onto the red list yet, but they are species that we want to watch really. And then the green list are those species that don't meet these criteria and are species that we're not currently they're not currently of significant conservation concern at present. So in this fourth assessment, Boccy 4, 211 bird species that occur in Ireland were assessed, and what we found was that 54 of these species are now on the red list, which is 26%, just over a quarter of all of the species which occur in Ireland are now on the red list. A further 79 or 37% are on the amber list, and collectively together that makes 63% of species on the red or amber list. In other words, they're species that are in trouble. Most of these are in trouble in Ireland, so they are declining in population or range in Ireland. Some other species are on the red or amber list for other reasons, possibly because they are declining in Europe, and Ireland holds an important proportion of their population. So the species that are on these lists are species that we really do want to take measures to protect. So 63% of the species that we have in Ireland being in trouble is basically, put simply, the worst status report of all the 4 Boccy assessments. And this is obvious when we look at the numbers of species that are on the red list. In the first assessment back in 1999, there was 18 species on the red list, and now that has jumped to 54. So the red list is getting longer, the green list is getting shorter, the amber list is also getting shorter, but that's mostly because more species are moving from amber to red rather than from amber to green. So trends are all going in the wrong direction, unfortunately. And so if we look at these lists in a bit more detail, I'm going to talk in general about the list, but I am going to focus on farmland species in a few moments. I just want to give you a flavour of the species that are on these lists. So on the red list, as we mentioned, there are 54 species. 17 of these have been added since the last assessment, since Boccy 3, and 3 species have moved directly from the green list to the red list, which is quite unusual. And these 3 species are redwing, curly sandpiper, and purple sandpiper. And for the other species that are on the red list, of those 54 species, they occur across a wide variety of habitats. So these are some of the species here on this slide you can see, and some of these will be well-known, familiar species to everybody. So puffin, for example, is now on the red list, as is razorbill and eiderduck as well. And the bottom 2 species there, kestrel and snipe, which are species more associated with farmland, they are now new to the red list. So it's across a range of habitats that species are being added to the red list, not just farmland. And on the amber list, again, quite long, 79 species, and some of these, 7 of them have moved directly from green to amber, and that includes some well-known and widespread species such as the willow warbler and the mallard. You'll be very it's very surprising to see a species as common as the mallard now on the amber list. And also on the amber list are species such as kingfisher, which has been on the amber list on all 4 assessments, and it's moving ever closer to the red list. So in this assessment, Boccy 4, kingfisher is still on the red list because the population decline is 45%. Once it reaches 50%, obviously it will tip over into the red list. But some of these species are moving further and further up the red list, up the amber list, and probably in the next assessment will be on the red list. And it's not just across a range of habitats that species are being added to the red and amber list, it's also across all seasons. So on the amber list, for example, there's 42 breeding species, 11 wintering species, 18 breeding and wintering species, and 8 passage species. So our birds are in trouble, not just across a range of habitats, but in all seasons as well. And one of the largest groups of species on the red list are the wintering water birds, and we have excellent data on changes in our water bird populations because of the long-running wetland bird survey that is funded by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which Burbage Ireland has been implementing on behalf of the government for many years. And some of you are probably involved in iWeb's counts and will be very familiar with this survey. But we monitor every winter some 600 wetland sites across the island of Ireland, and this information is fed into the red list, obviously. And a couple of years ago, we produced a report on the wetland birds, on the status of wetland birds in Ireland, and we showed in that report that there's been a decline of 40% in the population of our water bird species in the last 20 years. So that's almost half of the wintering water birds that occur in Ireland. The populations have almost halved in 20 years. So that is very serious. And these are some of the pressures and threats that are affecting our wintering water birds. And it's not climate change necessarily. We don't need to even look at climate change. The reasons for these declines lie much closer to home, and habitat loss and modification and damage, pollution, eutrophication, aquaculture, fisheries, human disturbance, all of these things are impacting our wintering water birds. And the cumulative impacts as well of all of these different pressures and threats are leading to these severe declines in our water bird populations. So I'm going to talk a bit more now about farmland birds, and this graph of farmland bird declines is one that may be familiar to some of you, and it's really based on, it goes back to the 1970s, and it's based on atlas data. We've been producing bird atlases in Ireland since the 1970s. And this farmland bird decline index is based on that atlas data. And what it shows is that between the 1970s and the 1990s, there was a huge magnitude of decline in our bird populations already detected by the bird atlases. And sorry, if you just go back, the Buckie assessments began in the late 1990s. With the first assessment, and by that stage already there had been very significant declines across a number of our farmland species. So what we've been doing in Buckie since is continuing to chart those declines, and unfortunately what I'll show for many farmland species is that the trends are continuing to go in the wrong direction.
Anita, just while you're on that slide, can I ask around that slight flattening from the 1990s? What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think there's been, well, I think what we'll see, Mark, is that the magnitude of the decline, I think, is not as great because because our populations are now so reduced that when you look at it on the scale, obviously the recent declines don't manifest themselves as significantly because the populations are already so low. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately, I don't think we can take a lot of comfort from that apparent flattening, because if we look in detail of what's happening to these populations, then their numbers and their range are continuing to go in the wrong direction, unfortunately. Just the populations are now much smaller. So if I go on to look at Buckie 1, these are the species, the farmland species that occurred on the red list in Buckie 1. And across most of the farmland habitats, we had species on the red list. Those that are circled there are Annex 1 species. So these are species on Annex 1 of the Birds Directive, and they are afforded the highest level of protection because under the Birds Directive, member states have to have to designate special protection areas for these particular species. So at that time in Buckie 1, there was 3 of these Annex 1 species on the red list. And if we look at the difference between Buckie 1 red list for farmland species and Buckie 4, we can see that an additional 8 species have been added to the list since then. One slight good bit of comfort that we can take is that chough and hen harrier down here moved from red to amber, but unfortunately additional species were added in the upland and coastal habitat sector. So in general, trends continue to go in the wrong direction. So corncrake remains on the red list, and it is an Annex 1 species and has special protection areas designated for it, but is joined by 2 other species, by meadow pipit and windchat, in relation to meadows. So you can see that, as I mentioned, 8 species are new to red between Buckie 1 and Buckie 4. All farmland habitats have experienced an increase in the number of red listed species associated with them. Actually, 1 species became extinct between Buckie 1 and Buckie 4, and that was the corn bunting. So these 16 farmland birds on the red list now are mostly common and widespread species that many people will be familiar with. So species such as red grouse, kestrel and snipe are now in serious trouble in Ireland. So what happened that these species moved onto the red list in the intervening period between Buckie 1 and Buckie 4? And quite simply, not enough was done to protect them. There was widespread loss and fragmentation of their habitats, and that's what caused these species to move onto the red list between Buckie 1 and Buckie 4. And this was something that the EU Commission flagged up with Ireland during the birds case. Some of you will be familiar with the birds case. The European Commission took a case against Ireland to say that not enough was being done to protect a number of species. And one of their complaints was that not enough was being done to avoid pollution and deterioration of habitats outside of designated areas, and in other words, in the wider countryside. So the Commission at that stage indicated that it believed that the measures taken by Ireland to protect species in the wider countryside are partial, isolated measures, only some of which promote the conservation of the bird populations concerned, but which do not constitute a coherent whole. And there has been an attempt to address the declines of species in the wider countryside. There's no doubt about that. And successive iterations of agri-environment schemes have become more targeted at these farmland species, these wider farmland species. But unfortunately, they have not been able to halt or reverse the decline of these wider countryside species. And whilst on the one hand, the agri-environment schemes have been attempting to protect and restore farmland birds, other aspects of CAP measures, including land eligibility rules, the production supports, and other measures such as TANs, they all continue to drive further biodiversity loss and are working against some of the gains that have been made from agri-environment climate measures. And the Irish government in 2017 produced a report to the Commission responding to the fourth complaint of the Birds Directive, of the Birds case. And in that programme of measures report, it stated that Ireland has introduced new measures and built upon existing activity. And they've highlighted some of the things that have been happening in the since 2007, since that complaint was issued. And they include things like the targeted actions in GLOS for species such as the corncrake, grey partridge, lapwing and twite, hedgerow measures designed to benefit owls and kestrel, wild bird cover designed to benefit species such as yellowhammer, and measures such as low input permanent pasture and traditional hay meadow measures in the agri-environment schemes which will benefit snipe and windchat. And Unfortunately, however, this fourth assessment shows that all of these species are still on the red list, and in fact some of them have moved from amber to red. So unfortunately, despite these agri-environment measures since 2007, trends are still going in the wrong direction for many of these species. And of course, it's not just a failure of agri-environment measures which have led to these continued declines. There are other factors at play, of course, and one of the key ones is that for these species that are not Annex 1 but are red listed, particularly some of the farmland species such as curlew, lapwing and snipe, they actually have very little protection in Irish legislation. So because they're not Annex 1, there's been no SPAs designated for them, and very often they're not a qualifying feature of SPAs or SACs. Under the Wildlife Act, nests and chicks are not protected from farming activity. So for ground nesting birds in particular, farming activity can destroy nests during the breeding season, during the normal course of agriculture. That happens, and that is also contributing to the declines of ground nesting birds in particular, and also other measures such as the EIA agriculture regulations, which are designed to try and protect some of these species. The thresholds are so high that most farming activity is not impacted by the regulations, and we see continued small-scale loss of biodiversity habitats is occurring widely across the country. So these reasons are also contributing to these declines. And other land use changes such as afforestation are also contributing, and there has been an attempt to address some of the concerns through various protocols and things such policies such as land types for afforestation, nature impact statements for forestry projects. All of these policies which are brought in to try and regulate afforestation, protect species, they're not always working. So land types for afforestation unfortunately still select some habitats which are important for some red and amber listed species. So and the nature impact statement for forestry projects, again, it's focused on designated sites, and as I've said, a number of these red listed farmland birds, they're not Annex 1, and therefore they don't have that level of protection. And certainly the forestry industry recognises curlew in particular as being a species for which may be severely impacted by forestry. And there has been an attempt to fold the requirements for curlew into forestry legislation, but the other non-annex red listed farmland species are actually falling through the net. And another very serious threat to these farmland birds, particularly the ground nesting species, is predation. And this list here that I've highlighted on the left, these are the ground nesting farmland birds on the red list that are being impacted by predation. And predation is a serious and growing threat. And in one study, one of the most comprehensive studies carried out in Northern Ireland by the RSPB, but it is indicative of what's happening to our ground nesting birds. Where this study undertaken by Murray Grant of the RSPB in Fermanagh and Antrim in the 1990s showed that up to 80% of nests and 60% of chicks were being predated. And that is occurring across all of our ground nesting birds, and is certainly a very serious contributor to why some of these species are on the red list. And we know the main culprits of ground nesting birds, so species such as red fox, grey crow, American mink. These are all predators of nests and chicks. But it's not just these; it's also species which are actually themselves protected. So species such as badger and pine marten, herring gull, these are also predating ground nesting birds the chicks and the nest of ground nesting birds, and as I say, these are themselves protected. So it's a very serious challenge to try and address the impacts of predation, and current land use policies such as afforestation and intensification. These together will lead to a greater abundance of these generous predators in particular, such as foxes and crows. In addition, nests are becoming more accessible because of fragmentation of habitats. So the habitats where these species are nesting are becoming more accessible because of fragmentation to these generous predators. And all of these things are working together to drive further declines of ground nesting birds. So are there any solutions to the problem of predation in particular? And one thing I just want to say is that I think we need to see within government a significant ramping up of predator control and nest protection measures if we want to tackle the declines in the ground nesting birds in Ireland. And measures such as predator fences can certainly help to protect nests from mammalian predators, but we need more professionally trained conservation keepers, particularly to control the avian predators which are predating the chicks, which do manage to hatch out. And there are initiatives such as the Curlew EIP, which are training farmers to do predator control. And this is, I think, something that we could look at in the next agri-environment scheme. Pay farmers to do predator control. Farmers are not doing it to the same extent as they used to. We hear a lot about, the bounty that was enforced, to help protect or to control foxes. That's not really widely being done anymore. And many farmers, what we find through the Curlew EIP, where we are training and mentoring farmers to do predator control, is that they are keen to get involved in this kind of work again. And through training and mentoring, such as we're doing with the Curlew EIP, this could be a measure that would be very beneficial to implement in some way in the next CAP. So get farmers out doing predator control. It's going to help control the background level of some of these general predators. You will need professional keepers on top of that, in particular farm and bird hotspots where predation is a major problem. But farmers can make a real contribution to helping to control background levels of these generous predators. So just to move on now to talk a bit more in the last few slides of my presentation about the next CAP and measures that are required to address and reverse some of these declines. The Farming for Nature Technical Group, funded by the Heritage Council, has done a lot of work developing proposed measures that will start to address some of the declines in our farmland biodiversity. So, and what we are advocating for is this tiered approach where there is enhanced baseline conditionality and then more and more targeted measures being implemented in the more and more focused areas, in these areas of farmland bird hotspots and farmland biodiversity hotspots, that that more and more targeted measures are applied within the hotspot areas. And there's been a lot of work done to identify the hotspots, the farmland hotspots, these areas of high nature value farmland. A lot of work has been done to map these areas, and these are the areas where CAP supports for biodiversity need to be focused. And I think one of the things that I want to make it very clear is that in order to reverse the declines in our farmland birds, and therefore in our farmland biodiversity, we need landscape scale restoration. So we need to try and protect and restore some of these habitats if we're ever going to reverse the declines in species such as curlew, lapwing, snipe, kestrel. These species require landscapes, not just bits and pieces of biodiversity on farmlands, but they need we need to restore landscapes and restore ecosystems at the landscape scale. And some of these areas that are shown in this map are the high nature value farmland areas where these CAP supports have to be targeted. And there are some very promising initiatives. The EIPs, which the department is co-funding with the European Union, which focus on a range of biodiversity, climate and water issues, and they're adopting this local collaborative approach, and they've developed a suite of mostly small-scale targeted solutions to some of our most pressing environmental challenges. And these are the kinds of things that we really need to see ramped up and better funded and implemented more widely in the next CAP. And so these initiatives, such as the EIPs, in the next CAP, they must be of sufficient spatial scale. They must allow for nuanced management. They must provide for ancillary measures such as capital works and advisory supports. All of these things, the EIPs are showing that all of these things, if they are in place, can really start making a difference. But they must also be financially attractive enough for sufficient numbers of farmers to join them to try and start implementing this landscape scale restoration. So, and I think that is a huge challenge. There's no doubt about it. And unfortunately, I think for for the agri-food industry, I'm not sure to what extent they're recognizing the challenge that that these assessments such as BOCI 4 are highlighting. And whilst we are hearing things such, the draft agri-food strategy to 2030, has important goals such as restoring, enhancing biodiversity, and indicating that 10% of biodiversity, that 10% of farms will be targeted for biodiversity, and that's great and it's really important. But let's not kid ourselves here. That's not going to deliver the landscape scale restoration that's needed, especially not if the other 90% continues to be intensively managed. So I think that's a very important point. And unfortunately, I think there's indications that the aim is to continue the competitiveness and the intensification of farms. So goal 1 is to improve the competitiveness and productivity of primary producers, which I think on the one hand indicates that as far as the agri-food strategy is concerned, very often it's going to be business as usual. And we want to see a much, if we're going to start to see some of these species being restored and enhanced, something has to change. And the United Nations has designated the decade of 21 to 2030 as the decade for ecosystem restoration, and that's really what we need. And I think just to finish up, the scientific consensus is clear. If we do nothing, our planet's natural cycles are going to be affected forever. So it's very clear something has got to change. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anita. Some sobering figures there within your presentation, and nice to see, though, that there are some solutions there. I think it's really, like you describe, a landscape approach that is needed. Birds don't differentiate between land parcel boundaries when it comes to choosing where they nest. We had a number of questions there specifically around the figures that we were showing on the barn owl, that there was some signs of increase of that population. Is there something that we can take from that or learn from that, or what might be causing that?
You might turn on your cameras.
You could turn on your cameras as well, yeah. And Una, I could invite you back as well. Join the discussion.
Yes, so I think with barn owl, yes, there's it's a species that we monitor very closely, and as we've got some really good information on barn owl, and certainly so I think there's some indications of recovery, there's some expansion of some of its prey species occurring, and I think that's contributing to the recovery of barn owl. But it's not, I think, it's not really an indication that the wider landscape is being restored sufficiently to protect and enhance its population. So
you refer to some of the agri-environmental schemes, the impact that they were having or not having on improving bird populations. What would you like to see happening in the next round of the Common Agricultural Policy to try and get that better joined up thinking at a landscape level, but indeed to tackle that? I know you mentioned about that predator control side of things, but I'm just interested on that. You mentioned it during one of your slides that forestation had an impact on predator populations. Maybe you could just explain that to us.
Yeah, so one of the impacts of afforestation is that it provides cover for generous predators such as crows and foxes. So it provides, places for foxes to hole up during the day, provides nesting habitat for grey crows and other corvids, and it's the and also I think just the habitat fragmentation that afforestation brings. So it brings all of these species in closer to these more open landscapes where the ground nesting birds, in particular species such as curlew and snipe, they like these wide open landscapes. That's where they thrive best. And by introducing forestry into these open landscapes, you're bringing the predators closer and closer to these populations.
Una, if I could just ask you around this, I suppose, this general debate about, the economic drivers behind, obviously, agriculture. How do we change the dynamics here to actually favour rewarding farmers to produce environmental services, ecosystem services? Is there enough coming from the marketplace? I know there's a lot coming on its way from CAP. I know you have some thoughts on that.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I suppose the question could be reframed as, what are the costs of not turning the situation around and of not finding solutions? Because it's not just, of course, that we're seeing that declines in farmland biodiversity, but we're seeing all the other indicators going in the wrong direction as well. And yesterday we saw the EPA reporting on ammonia emissions, as well as other national emissions that we're continually in breach of. So the CAP is, we're not exactly over the moon with what we've seen in the CAP so far. We feel like it's not as ambitious environmentally as it needs to be. But we do think the Irish government has an opportunity to increase the ambition, and we saw some good indicators at the last CAP Consultative Committee with the proposal at least for 30% of our parcel to be included as eligible land. But all through the CAP, we, as Anita pointed out, we need to see much greater ambition and targeting of public money towards public goods. So in terms of the market itself, I know that customers are demanding that change, that the companies of the products they buy are much more sustainable. So I think the market signal is growing, that people want, they're going to vote with their euros, and they're going to vote for products that they see are much more environmentally sensitive. Now, my concern is, and I really do acknowledge that, and I said it to you earlier, I'm from a dairy farming background, and we did rely on that milk check coming in the 1980s. So farmers are not getting enough for what they produce. So this is, I think, and there are increasing demands on them. So, you know, that I don't have an easy answer for how that should be turned around, but I really would like us to see a focus on, you know, and cutting production and focusing on much more high-end organic products. I think it would be an avenue for us. There is a market for this more high quality produce. And I'm not saying that the current produce isn't meeting standards and isn't of quality. I'm sure I could get into a load of trouble for saying that, but I mean that focus on less is more is what I would think is the way we need to go. And we know internationally, I mean, I know that we produce and export 90% of our produce, and it goes around the world, but globally we're seeing we're seeing on one hand demand for products, but we're also seeing a growing push for much greater environmental ambition. And the youth movement around the world, I think, is pushing this, and it's very important. And to go back to the original thing I said, Mark, is what are the costs of not doing this? You know, I feel like we're robbing the future generations of their chance of a healthy planet, and that is we just have to take it seriously.
Thanks, Una. Pat, lots of questions coming through.
Yeah, plenty. I'll just start with one directed at Anita. Should more agri-environmental scheme activity be targeted towards declining bird species that have relatively large populations, as opposed to the species that are that seem to be in terminal decline? Sorry, and maybe that's I'm reading the question, so don't blame the messenger on the use of the terminal decline.
Yeah, that's that's an interesting question, Pat. And I think I would say that the agri-environment measures can do certain things, and certain other much more focused and nuanced measures may be required for these species which are, you know, regarded as being in terminal decline. And I don't know at what point do you say a species is in terminal decline. You know, curlew have 150 pairs, but Dunlin have only 10 or 20 pairs left in Ireland, you know, so we haven't got to the Dunlin level yet with curlew, so there is still, you know, an opportunity to try and save that species, and there's a lot of good work going in through a range of initiatives, not just the curlew IP, but also the curlew conservation programme, you know, by the MPWS, you know, which is working very directly, you know, to try and implement these small scale measures. So I think agri-environment schemes have a certain role to play, you know, and you know, other more targeted interventions may be required, say, by the National Parks and Wildlife Service through you know, through additional measures. So
well, I suppose that the tenure of the question was, I suppose, to look at those species that are in decline but not in serious trouble yet, and is there a need for more focus on those before they go down to a level of serious trouble?
Certainly, you know, I think there is. And I mean, what I would also say is that, you know, when you start to implement measures for farmland biodiversity, you know, that are targeted at a particular bird species, you know, a wide other suite of different groups of organisms will also benefit from that, you know. So, you know, measures, for example, measures for curlew, you know, will also benefit the other breeding waders, you know, and they will also benefit other species such as skylark, meadow pipit, etc. You know, species that are, are also declining, but not to the same extent. So, you know, I think it's, you know, I would certainly, you know, I think we do need to focus on the most endangered species. That's not always going to be an agri-environment measure, an agri-environment intervention, but this is where I think we need to sit down, you know, and work out what are the measures that are going to be most beneficial and deliver the most benefits. I think, yeah, there's definitely a serious conversation to be had around that.
I'll give you two questions together. One is, how much damage will the dairy expansion, which has occurred over the past few years, do to bird populations in Ireland over the coming years? And do you genuinely think that this expansion needs to be halted or immediately reversed? And a second question then relates to farmers who are operating in relatively intensive situations. Are there things that they can do to support farmland birds?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll just take the second question first. Pat, so certainly, I mean, and I think this is, this is where projects such as the Bride project are so crucial in demonstrating that all farmers can take small scale actions that will improve biodiversity. So even on intensive dairy farms, there are things that farmers can do that will benefit biodiversity, and they may not be, they probably on these intensive dairy farms, they won't have the suite of really endangered species, because they'll already have gone, they're already no longer occurring on those intensive dairy farms, but other species are there. And there are measures that farmers can do to protect those species, not just the birds, but also but the other biodiversity, and to try and stop those moving further up, the red and amber lists. So without a doubt, there's many things that can do, and there are people who can talk much more authoritatively about this than me, but I would point to the Bride project as being a really good example of demonstrating how those dairy farms, intensive dairy farms, can still make a contribution. And can you remind me what the first question was?
It was basically asking about maybe it's one that Una might want to take in relation to the extent, the intensification and the I suppose the further growth of dairy.
Yeah, I wasn't very clear in the question. Sorry, could you just?
Okay, I have to find it again. Sorry. How much damage will the dairy expansion, which has occurred in the last few years, do to bird populations in Ireland over the coming years? And do you genuinely think that this expansion needs to be halted immediately or reversed?
So, just in relation to the like an example of a bird that is, I think, showing declines relative to changes in the landscape in the last 15 years, like the kestrel has seen a 28% decline in breeding population between 2006 and 2016. Now, research going back to prior to that shows that it was starting to decline before then as well. So kestrel, I mean, that is, I think, a response to the changes in the landscape and more homogenization of the landscape, and that it's and in particular for its prey species, which is small mammals. So, I mean, we are the overall declines that we're talking about are getting worse. So we're not seeing any recovery of the species where we saw catastrophic losses. So yes, I think that the intensification, we need to pull back on the throttle big time, not only for farmland birds, but to address the other environmental impacts, including water quality declines and greenhouse gas emissions. So,
if I could just add in there as well, that so further expansion of intensive grassland involves, for dairy industry, involves, the continued loss of these small scale areas, which, drainage of corners of wetlands, for example, drainage of rushy pastures, all of these small scale things, which, have contributed to species such as snipe now being on the red list, So, I mean, we're only going to see that problem getting worse and more of these kind of, it's the species that rely on this homogeneous landscape, that they are going to continue to be affected and are going to continue to decline, as these biodiversity rich little areas continue to be lost. So I don't think that there's any doubt the continued expansion of the dairy industry, if it leads to further losses of these little areas of biodiversity rich habitats, will certainly have a serious impact.
We have a question here in relation to forestry, and how do we tally ambitious forestry planting goals with trying to prevent further damage to habitats and risking further decline in bird populations? And I suppose there's different types of forestry within that, but maybe if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, so what we have seen so far is inadequate, let's say, siting of afforestation. There's no strategic, let's say, plan for where forestry should go. So, and when, and a lot of it's been targeted, I would say, and marketed towards high nature value farmland and marginal land, as it's called, which is often the best for biodiversity in the west and northwest. But not just in those areas. Again, it could be a marginal, a field in County Limerick, even, that would be rich in biodiversity. So what we're seeing is that there's not enough understanding or assessment of the biodiversity that is there on these sites, and before afforestation is considered, or as a forestation application comes in front of the Forest Service. It's very inadequate. The land types for afforestation document targets lands which are also good for birds. So, we have to go back to brass tacks and to really change this. Now, we had also proposed a forestry sensitivity map for farmland birds, which we think could be a helpful way to identify important areas for birds, which would be able to give more information on these important sites. But as we know, forestry is going through a somewhat of a review at the moment, and we really hope that the outcome of that would be forestry in the right place. I mean, we know we need more trees and the right kinds of trees, and we need a productive timber industry. But it just cannot come at the loss of the biodiversity that we have.
Thanks, Una.
There's a question there about the situation across other European countries, and are there countries that could act as exemplars in what they have done to protect bird life?
Well, I think, all European countries are facing the same problems as we are, and and I think often actually Ireland is held up as being, one of the better examples, particularly in relation to EIPs and locally led initiatives, particularly the Burren, which is really, I suppose, is one of the best known examples of the locally led approach delivering, biodiversity at the local scale. So, I mean, I think, and it's great. Ireland is leading the way, on some of these initiatives, and so, I think, we have the answers here ourselves, certainly for some of these problems, and I think we've taken I think great strides in trying to, in a small way, through examples such as the IPs in addressing those. So
I think Anita, there is a follow-on question in relation to that, and it's about the approach of results-based. How can we integrate results-based? I suppose it's been on a kind of a landscape, hasn't been, well, I suppose the hen harrier has been focused on bird species, but how can we focus results-based schemes on a broader range of bird species, if you want?
So I think, the results-based approach, so we've shown, the existing suite of EIPs, there are quite a number of EIPs across the country now where they are targeted at these particular hotspots, and through these EIPs, and I would hope that the ambition is to continue and expand them. A lot of them are due to end, at the end of this year or next year, and I think that it would be imperative that we continue and build on these programs. And it is about resourcing, Pat, there's no doubt about it. I mean, these, and it's not traditionally been the way supports have been delivered because, there are additional staffing requirements needed to make these EIPs effective, but the money that goes into staffing the project, so the deployment of the ecologists and the farm advisors, they actually are they are the things that make the difference on the ground to the biodiversity. I would argue that GOS, it was obviously an improvement on what went before, but GOS very often, the farmer was left to his own devices in terms of, or her own devices in terms of how to deliver these measures. And with the EIPs and the target measures, we've seen this much more focused approach, and that has delivered much better biodiversity. So although you have more resources required at the staffing, and you do get better biodiversity results out of it, So I mean, the answer is, that we replicate these EIPs. They may seem top heavy in terms of staffing, but that's what's required. We need to accept that because they are delivering the biodiversity much better than the broad brush approach of GOS.
Question there in relation to I suppose, given the lack of trees in Ireland, the importance of hedgerows, and I suppose we've had quite a bit of focus in over the last year in hedgerows, but do you believe that I suppose, better management of hedgerows by farmers can contribute significantly to the aims of birdwatch?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that that management of hedgerows has a very important part to play, but I think what we need to be clear on is the type of hedgerow is very important, and an old hedge that's been there for a long time has a lot more biodiversity associated with it than a newly established hedge, So, it's about the quality of the hedge as well, I think, the protection, Una knows a lot more about this than I do, but it's the protection of these older established hedgerows, which is going to deliver more in the way of biodiversity than the newer hedges. So, I don't know if you want to add anything. They're certainly an important feature, but establishing new hedgerows in open landscapes isn't always a good thing either. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Una.
Well, obviously hedgerows are really, really important. But I suppose, the managing and the quality of the hedgerows is really key for a wide range of species. But also, I just think it's important to note that you can't replace an old hedgerow and the biodiversity value of it with a brand new, let's say, just whitethorn hedge. Having multiple species of native Irish provenance in a hedgerow, having it being diverse, allowed to grow tall and wide where supported and not going to impact farmers, this is really important, really important measure, and we really think that the EIA regulations in relation to thresholds and the removal of hedgerows have to be really seriously looked at, because there's inadequate monitoring of what's being taken out. We saw one report from the Hedge Layers Association saying that there was I think it was about 300 kilometers of hedgerow taken out in a 5-year period. I mean, if those are old hedgerows, we're losing a lot. And so I just think, we can't be robbing Peter to pay Paul either. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Una and Anita. We're well over time this morning, but look, I'm happy to let it run there because it's really important conversation. So Anita, thank you for your excellent presentation, and we will make that available to everybody on our website as well. I think for me, there's a significant training element here as well in terms of educating farmers and the wider industry, and how we can create that more enabling and supportive environment to ensure that we try and get to that stage, that landscape level approach. So thanks, Pat, for helping with questions. I'd like to thank our production team, Andy Boland and Yvonne Maher, for all their work in the background. And next week, we'll be speaking to Thomas Duffy, who's a dairy farmer and also past president of Macra na Firma. And Thomas is going to be giving us a farmer's perspective on biodiversity, emissions, on water quality and water quality. So this maybe other side of the debate, and so we'll let our viewers decide, you know, how can we can create some ground for the two to come together, because I think that's what really is needed for us all to be working towards achieving this these targets. So with that, and I think
Mark, maybe a final comment, and I think it is very difficult to get in and look at the entirety of the problem in relation to the decline in birds and deal with it all in one topic. And it's maybe something we need to come back to and deal with on a landscape by landscape basis, and look at individual landscapes and what we might be able to do and what farmers might be able to do in those spaces. So I would look forward to, I suppose, continuing this conversation and maybe get a little bit more specific.
And I think there's an economics dimension here as well that has to be addressed as well. How can we make that work for us as well to achieve the targets, so that I think somebody commented there in the questions, we can't be green if we're in the red. So if farmers are in the red, how can they be green? And I think it's a fair comment as well. So we hope you enjoy the long weekend and stay safe, and we hope to see you next Friday morning at 9:30. Thanks again.
Thanks again, Mark. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.